there has been a lot of misnomers being out there about conflict of interest on city committees. So this is for you. I don't know whether you've all had an opportunity to peruse it or not. A couple of the highlights perhaps I'll ask Stephen to speak to, and then if we want to make further than what we already have in our committee, we can make a motion at our next meeting.
Maybe I can just use the attachments, because I think there was a request to put this on. So what I tried to do to help this discussion was put what I saw to be a couple of key documents on. And I also talked to the city clerk, and I also talked to a municipal government rep from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, so I had a good understanding of this, so I can kind of give you some kind of framework for this. In your agenda, if I can just draw your attention to page 8 and 7 for a second. And I'm going to go to 8 first, and all I really try to point out here is that if you look at the bottom, 19.6, I mean, council has its own procedural bylaws, and part of those procedural bylaws deal with conflicts of interest, but those are still framed within the provincial legislation. The important thing on page 8 is the bottom that says essentially all committees by that provision are covered by the same general rules and procedures as if it was council in a procedural body, right? So if I can go back to 7 for a second, so that you see the disclosure of interest. So if somebody believes that, so I'm on page 7, and if we look at the bottom, disclosure of interest, 18, 1, 2, and 3, right? What it really says, if somebody, and it is a very important principle with the conflict of interest, is that it's not the chair to determine if somebody has a conflict, it's not another member necessarily to determine, it's the individual that must determine if they believe they have a conflict of interest or not. So what this really provides for is that somebody then declares that they have a conflict of interest, right? And they generally, so you see there, 18.1, it's responsibility of the member to identify and disclose any interest, right? So that's why, frankly, you'll see on the beginning of the agenda here, there's a spot for a declaration of conflict of interest, right? And then, of course, the rules of government say if you've declared it that you have a conflict of interest, you can't participate, right? Either, and the important thing is that you can't sit through the discussion during and after the meeting. You can't influence the voting on any question, right? And if there was a particular reason for an in-camera, you can't stay in camera. So those are the issues that kind of frame how it's done. The Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, so pages 9 to whatever it is, 15 there, is it's a pretty detailed kind of document, but I'm going to try to just give you the highlights. Generally, it focuses on pecuniary interest, by the way. So you've got to have a pecuniary interest which is designed, which if you read a definition is of or in respect of money. So it's those issues, and it defines on page 10 kind of some issues of who's got a direct or indirect pecuniary interest. So it has to be pretty direct. There are some provisions that say when does it not apply, so it covers that. And those are really intended to guide people with respect to it. The issue with this committee is a little bit that you clearly have to be involved in a direct decision making, right? So if we take the issue of, and I'm simply not going to provide legal advice or anything here, but I'm just kind of framing this for you. If we take the issue of the waterfront development, for example, to put that in place would require council to amend the plan, some zoning bylaws, and official plans. So clearly, the primary decision-making of those issues is with the council, and this committee advises. So clearly, the conflict of interest is more heavily captured by the decisions of council with respect to that. The advice of the ministry, though, is obviously though you've got to be concerned a little bit about both perception, but at the end of the day, it is a legal test as to whether you have a direct conflict or not. So, Generally, if the advice, if anything, is if there's a concern or anything, to always err on the side of, being conservative with respect to such matters. And again, I'm hardly an expert with respect to these issues, but the thing that gets hammered home in the legislation and with the advice from the ministry is that it's always a personal decision about whether you believe you've got a conflict of interest. If you've declared it, you're fine. If you haven't declared it, then it's not for the chair or any individual to kind of to challenge that, but somebody can in a circumstance, and then the tests that are in the act are there. So I'm not sure if I made that really clear, but it isn't. The decision rests with the individual, and I know that the two council members know about these issues because it's covered a lot of council. In council's kind of procedures, you have to declare it, and at some point they hand a document to the clerk that says what's the reason for it. But generally speaking, those are direct pecuniary interests. So, give you an example in the planning field. If a member of council is an owner of a shopping center, and there's an adjacent commercial rezoning next door to that may or may not impact that, then generally a member of council that owned that shopping center would say that's that decision directly influences maybe the viability of my commercial venture, so I have a conflict in that instance. So some things are obvious, others maybe more remote, but it's the decision of the individual as to whether they would have a conflict.
Any discussion?
I guess a perfect example of what Stephen's talking about, my brother-in-law manages the marina. Whenever there are discussions at council in any way, shape, or form, I declare conflict and leave the room. And I come back in after the discussions are over. Two things that I wanted to make sure got cleaned up. A gentleman got up at the event and talked about conflict of interest by people in the room that were on the committee. And one of them was under the impression that Glenn Grant owned Cornwall Gravel, which is
lunch tonight,
yeah.
or dinner tonight.
And there's a big difference in those situations. The guy was under the impression that's who this guy was. Sometimes perceptions, when the questions are not asked. There was also some finger pointing to some extent to this gentleman right across here. I think you've been on the committee for 12 years?
I don't think that long ago.
Over 10?
No, I was here whenever they were rewriting the waterfront plan.
Okay, rewriting the waterfront plan, the plan was in 2007, so you would have been there before that?
Probably around, leading up to it, yeah.
Okay, so we're talking quite a few years. And so I just thought that it was sort of funny that those two situations were being brought up when you've been on the committee long enough that it should be plain by now that your focus is not on trying to make any money out of this. I haven't seen you move forward in any way, shape, or form to try to build anything on the waterfront. And you only do houses.
That's
You
what's
don't do
upsetting.
condos, you don't do
No.
big buildings.
People have asked me before, said, no, I have no interest in condo building, that is a separate type of business. I've had discussions with John Markle and Valerie, and I have no interest whatsoever. It's a different world. And my passion is single-family homes. The only thing I've ever developed was residential subdivisions for single-family homes.
I just thought it was important for the committee to understand that he's not Cornwall Gravel and you're not a developer of condos or big buildings.
Well, I had coffee with Lino yesterday and I called him dead.
You hope.
He's a friend, that's as close as it goes.
As well?
No.
Any further discussion?
I mean, the documents are there, if anybody has a question, that I can kind of
But you
help
know,
you one-on-one.
Stephen, the ministry was quite, when they gave us our training session, this is a few terms ago, they told us pecuniary interest. If you're going to benefit financially from it, walk away, declare it. Because what Denny just talked about is perceived conflict of interest. Because he's not gonna benefit because somebody gets a contract over there. Because the contract, first of all, isn't rich enough for the person that gets it. So it's perceived, and you have to make that decision yourself. But when you have direct pecuniary interest, then you have to declare, or else you're really sticking your neck out. So,
Well, I think the committee has on our agenda at each meeting, the declaration of conflict of interest. And we have been operating on that. There has been a lot of talk about, as Denise said, misconceptions about people in the community having, seeing conflict of interest around this table. And I think that bringing this information out at this meeting is just to assure everyone that we're comfortable, that nobody has been misleading anything at our meetings. And as I say, it is on the agenda, so if somebody's gonna make $1 million out of the waterfront, you know. So, any further discussion on that? No? Thank you. So we'll keep it on our agenda.